more than 80 years, your Colorado River District has been working to safeguard West Slope water and keep our water on the western slope.
We were formed 82 years ago to give voice and protection to the needs of the river and the people and the communities that depend on it.
Water is absolutely vital to this area. Without the water, the land has very little value. And without irrigation, we would grow nothing but sagebrush here. My great-grandfather came from eastern Colorado, and they came here with the opening of the Grand Valley Project, the Highline Canal, and continued farming here with my grandpa, and then my dad, and now myself and my son.
Whether you're a rancher in Moffat County or a boater in Summit County, you depend upon the Colorado River. And getting people to recognize their common interests and the leverage we have when we speak with one voice is what the Colorado River District does.
It brings together the communities, the different values, and helps us to find one voice. The large municipalities want more and more water. The River District provides the engineering, the legal protection, and advice to bring us all together.
The River District has managed over the years to fight the Front Range and the Trans Mountain diverters. We're able to bring a voice to the table and present that united front that is so important at keeping water in our rivers flowing westward.
It's important to keep water on the West Slope, primarily in what I do is for our livelihood and our farms. It's also hugely important to the municipalities and the people who live here. It's the same water that we irrigate with. It's also used for our recreational water systems. To keep a flowing river is important to all of us in this community. The pioneers who saw the potential in this valley also saw what they could do to develop the water and created a place where we could grow food and we could grow cattle and we could grow sheep. Without the water, this town here would be nothing more than Thompson, Utah, or a stop on the railroad.
We're protecting water supplies for the farmers and ranchers that put food on our tables. Because when farmers and ranchers thrive, the whole community thrives. This is your water. These are your rivers. And this is your Colorado River District.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here for our third Water With Your Lunch. Welcome back to my kitchen here in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. I hope you have your water and your lunch for this discussion. My name is Zane Kessler. I am the Director of Government Relations for the Colorado River District. I'm also a part of our external affairs team, all the folks on our external affairs team that have brought these Water With Your Lunch webinars to folks on the Western Slope and beyond over the last few weeks. As I said, this is our third in an ongoing series of lunch hour discussions focusing on important water issues facing West Slope water users. Today we're going to be joined by State Climatologist Russ Schumacher and River District Deputy Chief Engineer Dave Kanzer for a discussion about the interrelationships between climate and hydrology and the cycles of snow and rain and monsoons that collectively provide us with our most valuable resource on the Western Slope. Before we get started though, I want to take just a few minutes for those of you that haven't been with us for previous Water With Your Lunch webinars. I want to take a couple of minutes to tell you who we are at the River District and what it is that we do. For more than 80 years, the Colorado River District has worked to protect the water interest of the 15 Western Slope counties that we represent. We were created in 1937 to serve as the principal water planning and policy agency for those 15 counties. The district itself is an area encompassing nearly a third of the state of Colorado's landmass. The West Slope, as many of you know, contains about 80% of the state's water resources, but only about 10% of the state's population. Importantly, and I know that others will discuss this in a bit, Snowpack from this region generates some 65% of the Colorado River's natural flow at Lee's Ferry. And so that is a significant burden that we carry as the water producer for some 40 million people downstream. We are governed by a board of directors, one from each of the 15 counties in the district. Those directors are appointed by the respective boards of county commissioners, and we're funded almost exclusively through a mill levy on property in the district. So for those of you that are property owners within the river district boundaries, we want to thank you. We take our charge as a special district and a regional government very seriously, and we work as hard as possible to ensure that the dollars that we receive from our constituents are spent in a effective and efficient manner to ensure that we can continue to protect West Slope water interests. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Having a little bit of trouble with that. Oh, there we go. Sorry, folks. The inherent flaws in technology. Go to this slide here. So as I was saying, at the River District, we work daily to ensure that the water interests of West Slope water users are protected. We have a small but dedicated and hardworking team at the district. We're based in Glenwood Springs, and our water experts are active in all 15 counties of the district. We're working to protect historic agricultural water uses, providing environmental river flows from our reservoirs during hot, dry periods of the year for recreation, fish, and agriculture. We're working with farmers and ranchers and ditch owners to improve irrigation in the Gunnison River and determining the cause of and finding solutions for an algae infestation in the White River, and helping to ensure more reliable year-round water supply in water-strained basins such as the upper Uncompahgre. These are just a few of recent examples of our work. I'm really proud to be a part of the River District team and excited for the program we have here today. The bottom line really is that as a team, we're working every day on behalf of our constituents to protect West Slope water and keep your water on the Western Slope. Still having some issues with this slide advancement, but I think that's good. So with that, I want to go ahead and start introducing our first guest. Russ Schumacher is the Colorado State climatologist. He also serves as a faculty member in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. Go Rams. Russ received his Bachelor's of Science with majors in meteorology and the humanities from Valparaiso University in Indiana. He received his master's degree in 2003 and PhD in 2008 from Colorado State's Department of Atmospheric Science. His research interests include extreme precipitation, weather systems, the climatology of precipitation, and of course, Colorado's weather and climate. He's been a member of the CSU faculty since August 2011. It's my pleasure to invite Russ and look forward to hearing what he has to say. So thank you all for being here, and have at it, Russ.
All right. Thanks so much, Zane, and thanks everybody for having me here. Happy to take part in this. I certainly miss my trips out to the West Slope to visit with folks in person and talk about some of these, but there are advantages to having these virtual events as well, as we can get a lot of people, just to take a lunch break here and chat about some important issues. To begin with, see if I can get things to advance. There we go. To begin with, I just want to introduce a tiny bit about our office real quickly. So the Colorado Climate Center has been at CSU in Fort Collins since 1973. Prior to that, there was actually a federal program of state climatologists. But since the early 70s, it was kind of left to each state individually. And so in 1973 that it was established at CSU with support from the Ag Experiment Station and the university and other sources. So we've been here since then, and I've been in this role since 2017, so almost 3 years now. And our mission at the Colorado Climate Center is basically to provide weather and climate expertise for our state through climate monitoring. So collecting data, analyzing it, archiving it, et cetera. Climate research, especially on topics of drought and extreme weather and things like that are relevant to Colorado. And then climate services, everything from what we're doing here today to fielding data requests from citizens to groups and education and outreach and so forth. And so a lot of that has changed here in the last few months in how we do that, but it's great to be able to do that. And probably many of you are familiar with my predecessor, Nolan Duskin, who's in the back middle of this photo here, who was the involved in this for about 40 years and still works part-time with us. So we have his expertise still on board. I always like to start just to give everybody this picture of annual precipitation in Colorado. And this is put together from basically any sort of data we can get our hands on, and then at the highest elevations, incorporating some information from models and so forth. But it gives you an idea of the complexity of precipitation in our state and our weather and climate in general, because we go from everything from a high desert in the San Luis Valley, 7-ish inches of rain per year, very, very dry, to the high peaks of in the Rockies of 30, 40, 50 inches of liquid falling primarily in the form of snow. And we'll get into that as we go along here, and sort of everything in between. You can see the valleys and the higher elevations on the west slope and how complicated it is and how important those mountains are for the snowfall, but then also the rainfall at the lower elevations that we'll discuss here a fair bit. And just to kind of look at how that shakes out over the course of the year at a lower elevation location. So here's Grand Junction. Basically the blue line here is the average daily precipitation, with a running mean, and then the purple is the maximum for each day. And the main reason to show this is just to give you kind of a reminder of the seasonal cycle in Grand Junction. For example, the spring tends to be fairly wet, March, April, May, but then you see this huge drop off into the early summer where late June especially tends to be extremely dry, but then it ramps back up into August and September in the North American monsoon season. And so that's when the rains really return. Again, it's dry at the low elevations on the west slope, so it's only a couple of inches on average during that time period, but still quite important. And then of course the majority of the water, as we'll be discussing today, comes from the snowpack that gets stored up at the high elevations. Now, if we look at so that what we looked at there was the kind of average picture, but when we look at individual years, it tells a much different story. And this is the last 3 water years for Grand Junction. We tend to analyze water years, so running from October through September, and so because that captures the buildup of snowpack and then the runoff and so forth. And so the brown line here is the average accumulation over the water year, close to 10 inches in the annual total at Grand Junction. So this goes back to water year 2018, so all the way back to October of 2017. I'm sure most folks remember the terrible drought of 2017 into 2018. Very little snow in the mountains, extremely dry in western, especially southwestern Colorado. So that ended up being the 4th driest water year on record for Grand Junction. And then we switched to the next water year, October of 2018, and sort of immediately shifted gears to actually quite a wet period, a huge snowfall year in the mountains in the winter of 2018 into 19. And so we went from October through May there was the second wettest on record for Grand Junction. Some mountain areas got their most snowpack they had ever seen. But then we got to the summer when that monsoon is supposed to kick in, and it didn't. And so this was the fourth driest June through September on record at Grand Junction. And so we went into this past winter with the soils being very dry from that very dry summer and fall. And then it's been dry for the most part since then. So far in the water year, October through the middle of July here, 14th driest so far at Grand Junction, going back well over 100 years of records there. So there's been no kind of typical period here lately on the western slope. It's either been very, very dry, or for that one winter, very, very snowy. And if we look now across the state where we're at in the current water year so far, so we're more than 9 months in now. This is through the end of June, with precipitation on the left and temperature on the right. So those orange and red areas are where it's been very, very dry. And you can see almost all of western Colorado has been quite dry for this water year so far, as well as parts of the San Luis Valley and parts of southeastern Colorado. In terms of temperature, it's been warm across the western half of the state, although not extremely warm, but warmer than average. And some parts of southwestern Colorado have been quite a lot warmer than usual. And so let's come back then to this this issue of snowpack that we talked about, and the next speaker will certainly focus on in even more detail. Colors didn't come through here very well, but that's all right. I can kind of tell the story here with the numbers. So this is where we were on April 1st, and the different basins are supposed to be outlined here, but it didn't show up very well in the picture. But in any case, hopefully you can see those little numbers in there, which reflect the percent of average of snowpack on April 1st. And you can see really throughout all the mountain areas, things were in decent shape as of April 1st, right around average. So 100 here would be average. So most of the basins were, either just a little below or a little bit above average at that point. But then the spring turned very warm and dry, and by May 1st, especially these southern basins, so the southwestern basins, the Rio Grande, and then the Gunnison Basin really dropped off quickly. So went from around average on April 1st down to maybe only 70% of average just a month later. And that was because of the quick warm up and the lack of precipitation in April especially. And we can see that in the picture of how the snowpack came about over the course of the winter in two of the different basins. So on the left is the headwaters, kind of the upper headwaters of the Colorados going up towards towards Grand Lake and up in that area. And so kind of north of the northern part of the basin. And what you can see here, so that this year is in this dark blue or dark black color. Here, the average is in the purple. And so you can see in the upper Colorado headwaters actually followed pretty closely to an average year in terms of snowpack accumulation. It peaked just a bit above the average actually, and even peaked a little bit later than average, although you can see there was sort of a double peak here, so that second one ended up just being slightly higher than the earlier one. And then the melt did happen pretty quickly, but not that unusual for those northern basins. But then if we go a little bit farther south to the Gunnison Basin, similarly it peaked a bit below the average, but right about on schedule. But then this melt out here was quite a bit quicker than normal, and so the runoff was happening a couple weeks sooner than average. And this has been the sort of thing that we've started seeing more frequently in recent years, is the snowpack may reach a fairly typical peak, but then the melt out starts happening sooner. And this was a couple of weeks earlier than average for complete melt out there, and certainly quite different from last summer, where the snow hung around into early July. Okay, and then so we focus in on this spring period here. April through June, this, again, most of the state was quite dry in this time period, and also very warm in Western Colorado. So this was not good for kind of holding on to the snowpack later on, and started to stress systems out and bringing drought back pretty quickly through this April through June time period. So we know that, of course, precipitation is really important, the snowpack, the rainfall, but also the temperature stresses out the system, and we'll hear more about this in more detail in the next presentation. But this shows the average temperature across the state. Obviously, this is a bit of a simplification, because averaging over a state as complex as Colorado is, you miss some details in there as well, but certainly the clear warming trend over the last century plus, 125 years or so, with really a long string here of warm years. And so of the 12 warmest years on record statewide, 9 of those have happened since 2000. And this trend is even a bit more amplified in Western Colorado. We've seen a bit more warming in Western Colorado than east of the divide. So this is for basically all the areas in Western Colorado averaged together, same sort of thing, where you can see those warm periods back in the 30s, but now those kinds of periods are much more common. And again, in Western Colorado, of the top 14 years on record, we've had 11 of those since 2000. If we look at precipitation, this is for statewide, and same in Western Colorado, there's actually not much of a trend. We have some very wet years and some very dry years, but not and we've had a few very extremely dry years interspersed with wet years here more recently, but there's not actually much of a long-term trend in terms of precipitation, but even with steady precipitation, that increase in temperature makes a difference. But of course, looking at these averages also can kind of mask some of the other challenges that come with this. And this is temperature at Grand Junction for this water year, so going back to October. And in general, it's been quite a warm year, and especially this spring, you can see all these highs above the average, and a lot of warm nights as well, the blue dots being well above the average line in blue there. But it doesn't mean we miss out on these really extreme events. And I'm sure folks are especially the fruit growers, remember very well the extreme cold at the end of October. So very, very cold blast there, very unusual. And similarly, the hard freeze in mid-April that did so much damage to the peach crop. So even within a really warm year like this, we still can have these blasts of really, really cold conditions interspersed. So the challenges don't go away for Western Colorado. And this is Montrose as just another example, kind of the same picture in a generally quite warm water year so far, but still those couple of periods of really extreme cold. If we look at reservoir conditions, now we're looking at water specifically. Blue Mesa on the left, McPhee on the right. What we see here in the black here is where we've been over the last couple of years with respect to sort of the average range. And what we see is last year's huge increase, basically up to about up to capacity. But now with the early runoff and hot dry conditions, those are starting to tail off. And McPhee especially is now dropping off pretty rapidly into the kind of area where we don't really like to see it. And at Lake Powell here, you can see that things remain in bad shape there with respect to the long-term average. That's nothing new. But even last year didn't even get us back into sort of the long-term average range with a great snowpack year. And now we're tending downward at Powell again. Okay, so I want to highlight just real quickly, this is our CoAgMet network that our office operates. So these are weather stations across the state in the agricultural areas to provide information, especially that is hopefully useful for farmers and ranchers and anybody else who's kind of interested in the weather. And the website will show up in your chat there. So if you want to, and it's on the screen, if you want to take a closer look, if you're not familiar with these. So we have some new maps just so I want to highlight, but one here, these are my favorite new maps that we started making that reflect how long it's been since you've had a day with a 1/4 inch of rain. at these weather stations going back to April 1st. And so all these places where you see the 102s here is going all the way back to April 1st. There hasn't been a day with a 1/4 inch of rain. And so you can see some of these areas in western and southwestern Colorado haven't seen a wet day basically since the beginning of April. Now it is the dry time of year generally here early in the summer, but still not looking great there. So that's just another way of kind of reflecting the recent dryness that we've had. And another way to look at this is in terms of the water balance for evaporative demand. So the left here is basically how thirsty the atmosphere is. And this is for our station at Olathe that's been there since the early 90s. And this year is in blue, and red is the maximum, which through this part of the year is 2018. So we're essentially tracking 2018 in terms of evaporative demand at Olathe so far this year. And that's not the company that you want to be in if you remember what 2018 was like. Precipitation has been very low, not as low as 2018, but still very low. And so the water balance is basically as bad as it has ever been, at least in the last 30 to 40 years at Olathe. And you can kind of see that here going back to the early 90s, that this, at least through this point in the summer, we're right up there with 2018 in terms of the evaporative demand. So that kind of reflects those hot, dry conditions. The U.S. Drought Monitor, just to kind of give you a sense then of how this is all coming together, the southern third of the state or so is in the D3 condition, extreme drought. Kind of all of the southern half of the state is in the D2 severe drought category, and conditions have not gotten better certainly over the last few weeks, aside from in some pockets in the eastern plains that have gotten some good rains. So we're really hopeful for that monsoon to come back, as we get into August, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Just taking a real quick look at the forecast here. The mountains, the good news is that the mountains over the next week or so, this is the 7-day precipitation outlook. The mountains should start to see some more precipitation, especially the southern mountains over the next week or so. Some of that monsoon moisture is starting to kind of creep back in here as we get towards the end of July. So that's the good news, but you can see the lower elevations on the western slope are not really expected to see much rain, at least over the next week. And these maps give you try to give a sense of like how important each month is for precipitation. So where you see the dark reds is like a lot of that location's rain falls in that month. This is for July. Where you see the browns, usually that's a dry month. So western Colorado in July tends to be still relatively dry. The eastern plains are quite wet. If we go into August, though, then we start to see, especially in southwestern Colorado, quite a bit of the precipitation that you get each year at the lower elevations comes in August. And the San Luis Valley also August is a really critical month. And we go to September, and that tends to be one of the wetter months of the year, the lower elevations on the western slope. So we can still be hopeful to get some decent monsoon rains to at least cool things down and kind of prevent things from getting worse. That's what we would expect on average, but as we've seen, we haven't had a lot of average years lately. And if we just look then quickly at the temperature outlook, so this is now looking out for the rest of the summer or through September. What these show is basically that this is temperature, the probability that it's going to be warmer than average, and it's very high in western Colorado and really throughout the West. We've started July fairly warm, although not excessively warm, but basically the pattern is pointing towards warm conditions leading into the fall. In terms of precipitation, there's much less confidence in that outlook. A slight tilt toward drier than average conditions in western Colorado, but not a real strong signal there. So that's all I've got here, at least for this part. And our website is here, and my contact is here. And we like to post lots of weather tidbits and facts on our Facebook and Twitter. So feel free to follow us there if you haven't already. And I guess we'll save the questions for the discussion later on.
That was great, Russ. Thank you so much. What an amazing amount of information in a short and concise period of time. So thank you. I should, on that note, remind folks that I failed to mention earlier, we do have a Q&A function. It should be located in the bottom of your screen. please feel free to submit questions for Russ or for Dave, our next panelist. We're going to have a panel style Q&A session as soon as both presenters have finished with their PowerPoint presentations. So go on ahead and start submitting any and all questions you've got, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Our next presenter is a friend and a colleague at the River District. He is the Deputy Chief Engineer here at the district. Dave Kanzer has been working on the complex web of water quality and quantity issues facing the Colorado River Basin for 25 years. Since he started out in 1995, Dave, or DK as most of us know him, has focused on both the local challenges facing Colorado River District constituents, as well as the long-term regional water supply and demand imbalances that have plagued the basin. Along with the Colorado River District team, Dave is implementing a myriad of projects and programs to help address growing demands and dwindling supplies. The one that really strikes or rises to the top for me is Dave has been our lead on the Lower Gunnison project in Delta County and has worked with those communities there to improve both on and off farm efficiencies, and has really just been an amazing resource for those communities in the Gunnison Basin. Of course, he does work throughout the district. I'm really happy to have Dave here today. Dave, professionally speaking, is a professional engineer in Colorado. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in geological engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. Thanks for being with us, Dave. Take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you, Zane. Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here in my undisclosed COVID-inspired bunker outside of Glenwood Springs. By looking at the list of participants, I see a lot of old friends and some new names. So I'm really pleased that you're all taking your time and your lunch to have some water and talk about rising temperatures and rising challenges. And we do have quite a bit of challenges here that we're going to go through. I do also want to give kudos to Russ. Fantastic, setting the stage for me and discussing all the data that is so critical to what we do in our day-to-day activities, in our planning, and the excellent resource that the Colorado Climate Center represents. Now, as we move forward here, I want to pull back the lens, so to speak, from just Colorado to looking at the entire Colorado River Basin. This is a familiar story to many of you. A few things to point out here is that the Colorado River District up here really is a critical piece of the puzzle to the Colorado River Basin. The basin split into two at Lee Ferry, shown in red. What's also shown here is the gray areas that represent areas of use of the Colorado River. So there's quite a bit of exports, and if you've been around the Colorado River, this is not a surprise, but one that really makes our job and the challenges related to climate and hydroclimate really significant. One other piece to point out here before we move on is the Southwest District, the Southwest Colorado, Southwestern Conservation District, excuse me, also helps represent the Colorado River and its uses. So they're sort of our sister conservation district that we work with. The story, as I said, the Colorado River Basin is sort of a two-phase system. In the upper basin, the water supply arises high in the mountains. Almost 90% of the water that arises flows into Lake Powell. It flows past Lee Ferry, flows from the upper basin, the Green and Colorado main stem rivers. The lower basin is really characterized by a huge demand, a huge growing demand. And almost 90% of the demand and the people are located downstream of Lake Mead, Lake Mead shown here, Lake Powell shown here, two critical facilities that help us manage our resources. So the story of the Colorado River is also told, as Russ said, in our geography. The mountains are where precipitation falls. The blue polygons here really represent the lion's share of the yield of the basin. And you can see extremely small area relative to the 300,000 miles that make up our watershed, the larger watershed that covers 7 states and 2 countries in a sense. So we need to be careful in how we curate and manage these waters. And as temperatures rise, these vulnerable areas really come into focus for us and where we're focusing our energies. So this is no surprise that precipitation drives our water supply, our water future, the hydrology. And what is a little bit interesting, I think, is how the system can be really kind of characterized into 3 different parts of the water supply equation, at least in the river district. These numbers are based on really the state line. And Zane was correct when he looked at Lake Powell, snow accumulation about 50 to 60%. But when you look at our state line in Colorado, Utah, really about 80%. That's the main game that we're dealing with. Smaller inputs to our system, the monsoon that Russ talked about, really prevalent in the south part of the river district, sometimes doesn't really impact the north. So it's a smaller slice of the pie. Groundwater input and, and base flow represent the last fraction. And this is shown here in this plot, this cartoon. You can see the segments of the hydrograph and how it splits out between snowmelt, runoff, base flow, and monsoonal. In the blue is sort of the historical hydrograph, and what we're calling the new normal is what we've been experiencing really due to warming that we've experienced since 2000, but even beforehand, the trends are there where we're shifting the whole hydrograph lower and earlier. So the snowmelt and runoff, that critical piece, is shrinking. The monsoon can be up and down here. This is not to indicate that we have less monsoonal activity, but overall, the pie has shrunk throughout the entire hydrograph. So we need to adapt to that new normal. We need to come up with some solutions to address these stresses. So reiterating that fact, snow is our largest reservoir, where the overwhelming supply comes from snow, and it's a short amount of time. And sometimes our whim, our fate can be decided by 1 or 2, 3 storms throughout a year. That white reservoir stores that water high in the mountains, typically above 9,500 feet, and it can determine that imbalance between supply and demand and our challenges. Whether we have a 2019 year when all needs are met and we're refilling reservoirs, or a year like this, or 2018 or 2012, if you live through those, when that stress really rises and we rely on these reservoirs, the white reservoir and our physical reservoirs throughout the basin. Obviously, snow boosts our recreational economy, and as the climate change, that means snow change, that means hydrology change. As you look at the snow hydrographs, and Russ walked us through the 2 years or 2 basins, you know, that we're also seeing a shrink or a change to earlier peaks and lower peaks. These are very generic. Year to year, we can have radical changes, again, as we've just talked about. But the shape of that and the impacts can be really discussed in these 2 sort of issues. That's when the snow melts, The infiltration determines the runoff. It's a highly inefficient system. Well, what does that mean? We lose, according to Western Water Assessment, up to 90% of the precipitation that falls. In other words, only 10% of the precipitation that we get in the Colorado Rockies within the river district, or within the upper Colorado River Basin, I should say, is lost to other uses, to vegetation, to evaporation, in other words, to evapotranspiration. So the yield depends on the depth of the snow, the density of snow, and then that loss. When you look at the preceding soil moisture, that dictates that infiltration, how much we lose. And in addition, we are experiencing increasing dust impacts, which can also lead to increased losses. How do we capture all this, and how do we manage is a critical issue, and one that we rely on the Colorado Climate Center to help us understand the spatial distribution and variability of snowpack, where it falls, again, how deep, the density. We are limited by those points that Russ showed, those snow tail points. We can certainly model between those points, and we do, but our models are only good as our data. So we're really trying to beef up the data, and the Colorado River District is working with partners on that. We have very diverse snow sheds, as I call them here. Those that face north can really retain the snow. Those that face or have a southerly aspect can melt off quickly, and we're feeling this quite a bit in the Southwest District, the south side of Grand Mesa, the North Fork of the Gunnison, where a lot of good snow disappeared quickly this year. So we're subject to significant error and uncertainty. When you look at the map of the upper Colorado River Basin, this one I think is pretty dramatic, visually dramatic, showing those elevations, those thin slices, really above that sweet spot of 9,500 feet, where snow can accumulate and help us fill that white reservoir. Extremely small percentage, really only about 15% of the land mass of the upper Colorado River Basin is above that area. Climate change and warming is pushing up that critical elevation, from 9,000, 9,500, where the snow and rain interface is changing. So it's the dynamics and the ability of that white reservoir to hold our snow is being adversely impacted. Just to zoom in here to the Colorado River District in our backyard, if you live in the district, you may see some of these features that you know and love, the Gore Range, the West Elks, the San Juans, Grand Mesa over here, this is a little bit delayed, Grand Mesa, and the Flat Tops. Those are the areas that are really critical to our snowpack accumulation, and those that we really need to focus on our monitoring and assessment and understanding. Meanwhile, unfortunately, we are experiencing these temperature changes, and this is real data. You can see the highlight of the Colorado River District boundaries, the 15 county area. We are sort of in the bullseye. The full upper Colorado River Basin is in the bullseye of climate change. These are real data. These are not model data per se. These are, show that temperatures since 1895 in a large area of the upper Colorado River Basin have risen over 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look at what that means for our district, we are seeing these levels of temperature change and need to plan for a warmer future. I mean, this is a look back, but this also portends the future. These numbers could grow, and the models do suggest these areas will grow warmer, stressing further our water supply. Well, how does it affect our water supply? This is a model study. There's a whole series of these studies, but it boils down to this simple summary. every 1 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, stream flow in the Colorado River Basin is reduced between 3 and 5%. Recent studies actually have found or concluded that these numbers are low. Could be up to 9 or 10% decrease in stream flow for every 1 degree increase of climate. A little bit eye-opening. So what are we doing? Those rising temperatures lead to rising impacts. I've touched on these. These are inherently obvious. More rain, less snow, less in our wet reservoir. Earlier snow melt, talked about that. What we didn't talk about is how those losses could increase. We have a longer growing season. We have more snow evaporating directly through sublimation. We have more going into the dry soils, and overall more water lost to the atmosphere, less for us in our stream system. So we really need to be careful and curate and work hard to keep what we have, our diminishing supply. It leads us to this imbalance that we're feeling. And our reservoirs, this picture of Lake Powell tells the tale of water demands, water use outstripping the supplies. But really it's a two-phase issue: decreasing water supplies, increasing demands, and the risk that poses from a warming hydroclimate and increasing uses and low reservoir storage means we all have to be working even harder. And the Colorado River District is doing that on your behalf. We're taking these actions to address some of these issues. Zane talked about the Lower Gunnison project. That Lower Gunnison project is focused on infrastructure, modernizing aging infrastructure to improve that water use efficiency. So we can divert less water out of the streams, leaving more in the streams, but accomplishing more, doing more with less. That's a really, I'll talk a little bit more about that example, but we're trying to do this across the 15 counties. And in fact, there are some successes throughout and outside the Colorado River District where technology and efficiency, water use efficiencies are climbing to allow us to do more with less. In addition, we're actually working on the supply side through cloud seeding and non-native vegetation control. We're looking at how we can operate more efficiently our reservoirs, the large reservoirs, the federal reservoirs, to move water downstream in a fashion to minimize evaporation, but to protect hydropower resources and the ability to keep water in the stream for habitat, fish and wildlife habitat, excuse me. There's more to the story, and that's looking also at the demand side. A lot of you are probably familiar with the feasibility study of demand management. The Colorado River District is will be convening West Slope focused groups to look at how we may, if we should, and how we may participate in demand management. So if you're in our 15 counties, stay tuned. You'll be hearing more about demand management studies. We can save water and put it into Lake Powell, hopefully. That's the concept. So this infrastructure improvement concept, it's a comprehensive approach. We're not just looking at one structure here, one structure there. We're looking at integrating diversion structures shown here in this picture, along with pipelines, putting in new pipelines, eliminating those earthen canals that can be leaky, that can be seeping, that can be causing adverse impacts, to meet multiple benefits. We're doing this all together. We're able to bring together a portfolio of funding, federal funding, state funding, local funding, and that local funding is really driven by local agricultural producers. They're out there improving their own system. They're expensive, and we're trying to help them do that. This helps improve not only water availability, but water quality. That means reducing the return flows that can bring salt, selenium, nutrients, pesticides to the river system. So it's really critical to minimize those losses for a number of things. Habitat also benefits. And if you look at this structure that was just completed on the Smith Fork of the Gunnison, we have provided a fish passage structure through and past what used to be an impermeable or impassable barrier. So now this is a fish-friendly structure. It's also efficient, only diverting that which is needed. Which is not needed goes back to the stream through this screen structure. And it's a pretty, I think, win-win-win situation. We're trying to do that elsewhere. Moving quickly on to some other activities that the River District is involved in. And this is one which I think unnecessarily is, in some people's eyes, controversial, but it's studies have shown that it is safe and effective. It's really the only way to increase water supplies through cloud seeding. We're doing this not by ourselves, but with a regional effort that involves really all 7 basin states, municipalities. What we're doing is growing the pie, growing the supplies so that all ships float higher. It provides multiple benefits, as you can see: recreation, environment, and of course, human uses. Skiers can ski on it, boaters can boat on it, agricultural users can benefit, and we think it's a winning strategy. It works. Studies show that cloud seeding can increase the right type of storm by up to 15%, and over a period of series of storms, at the end of the year, we can have upwards of 5% increased flows in volume. This has been verified through multiple independent peer-reviewed studies. And as I say, cloud seeding is safe. We also have multiple independent verified studies that show the introduction of the media that we use, which is silver iodide, is environmentally safe and in really undetectable in the environment, but effective nonetheless. It is a geoengineering type of solution, one that again has its detractors, but one I think when you look at the balance, it's the right thing to be doing. We previously gave a more in-depth presentation on this. It's on our website. Come look for resources on that if you're interested in cloud seeding. We could spend a lot more time on that. But really, in summary, to give you some time to have a discussion with us and us with you, I want to just kind of go over what I covered and what Russ covered. We know the problem, and it's not getting any better right now. We have very variable conditions. We have a warming hydroclimate, and our water supply imbalance, as shown by our large reservoirs, is not good. Those reservoirs, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, are below 50%, and now with 2020 projected to keep falling. So we need improved management. We need to keep boosting our scientific understanding, again, through work with the Colorado Climate Center, NOAA, the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. We are increasing our forecast reliability and our ability to make real-time decisions in a much better way. We need to produce more snow, and we need to use less water. These are pretty basic conclusions, and one I think we can all get behind. So how do we do that? That's the tough part, right? We need to improve infrastructure, invest in technology throughout our critical watershed, our snow sheds. We need to augment through cloud seeding. We need to minimize losses, and really need to integrate our information and coordinate regionally. And this is all also, I think, I should say, consistent with the Colorado Water Plan, the Basin Roundtable process. These are the kind of coordination, along with the basin states, that we are doing together, and we want to engage with you all. So we really appreciate your time and attention here. I'm going to turn it back over to, I guess, Jim Pokrant is going to help Zane, and Jim will facilitate some discussion for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dave. Really appreciate that overview. Yeah, why don't we invite both Russ and Jim back to the screen, just by way of introductions. Many of you participating today probably know Jim Pokrant. You've seen him out at Rotary clubs or States of the Rivers in your communities throughout the district. Jim is our Director of Community Affairs at the district and is really our boots on the ground in communities in each of the basins within the river district boundaries. Jim's gonna facilitate a Q&A with Russ and Dave. A reminder, keep submitting those questions. We've gotten a few really good ones. And with that, I'll shut up and turn it over to Jim, Russ, and Dave.
Thank you, Zane, and thank you folks for who have submitted some questions, and please keep them coming. Since we just finished off with Dave, let's start with a question for Dave. And Dave, the question is, the widening gap between supply and demand for the Colorado River water makes it increasingly important to have accurate runoff forecasting. What new technologies in measuring and modeling snowmelt runoff, and for that matter, snowpack, are available to improve forecasts?
So that's a great follow-up question. I touched on it briefly. You know, the River District participates with this coalition of folks, and at the forefront recently is the Western Water Assessment. They've just released an amazing compendium report on the science of the Colorado River. So Western Water Assessment goes through in this report how we are working on increasing the tool set, the modeling tool set, the forecasting tool set, but those are all based on our base data. And so on the data collection side, we are kind of pushing into the 21st, 22nd century by deploying what was put together by NASA, which is a airborne snow observatory. And when I say we, again, we're a small part of this team that now has gone private. What they do is they put a plane up. They essentially use LIDAR, which is a fancy radar system, to look at that snow depth and density to try to come up with a very quantitative amount of snow on the ground. And we do this, or they do this, you know, based on how much money is available. It is expensive. And they can come up with an amazing data set that shows where the water is in our white reservoir. That information is then put into these models run by the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, improving those and helping us understand in real time how these conditions are changing, whether a new storm comes in or whether we have a hot, dry spring like we did this year, and how that snow is disappearing. So that's an example. There's a lot going on in that State of the Science report that Western Water Assessment out of University of Colorado Boulder has put out there. So I would really, and we can put that link, I think, in our chat for those that want to chase that down. But those are some of the brief answer to a really long question.
Yeah, I think it was a long answer to a short question. but
just to, Jim, if I just chime in with one other thing there too. I mean, DK kind of got to this, it was embedded in what he was talking about, but the really big issue we have with this is that so much of the snow accumulates up at the very highest elevations where you can't measure it with traditional methods. You can't just go put towers up or snow-tell sites up at 13,000 feet because there's no way to get there in the winter. So that's where I think a lot of the uncertainty comes up there, and that's where the flights can be useful if places can do them. But that, that plus the inability to accurately predict, the storms out beyond a week or two, those are two big limitations in having those forecasts be accurate.
Well, Russ, since you have the mic, what about, you just touched on it, improving the accuracy of, or the time scale of forecasting, and we chatted about that earlier. Tell us what's happening in your community in regards to predicting storms.
Yeah, so I mean, our field, I think, has made huge advances at the weather forecasting sort of timescales. We now can predict a storm coming in, a week or so in advance with pretty good accuracy. Maybe not the details of exactly which mountain range, which peaks are going to get hit more than the others, but that a big storm is coming in, that doesn't really catch us by surprise anymore. So at that sort of time frame, things are so much better than they used to be, but it's still just because of how the atmosphere works, it's a struggle once you get out beyond 10 days or so to have very accurate outlooks. And so and especially in the summer, we've seen that the last couple of summers where the outlooks were kind of optimistic for the monsoon season, and that just did not pan out at all. And so that's an especially hard time period, beyond a week or so. But even in the winter, if we could figure out the way to pin down exactly what's going to happen with the snowpack, a month in advance, just think about how useful that would be for so many different applications. But there's a lot of people working on it, but we're not there yet.
So here's a question somewhat related, Russ. If you could please comment on the relatively new concept of flash drought as it occurs on the western slope as opposed to the eastern plains.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is a kind of a new idea and an emerging concept for the drought community. And I think it's probably more of an issue than the eastern plain. On the western slope, pretty much all the ag is irrigated. Obviously, rangelands is a different story, but the eastern plains, you've kind of got more of a mix, and that's where you can get these periods where, for example, early this summer, much of June on the eastern plains was extremely hot, extremely windy. And precipitation was low, but not excessively low, and it's those kinds of conditions where the flash drought can come in. And then that's especially a big issue further out in the Midwest, where you do where they grow corn dry land, and if you have a month of like 2012, a month of 90, 100-degree temperatures and no rain, everything goes south pretty quick. I think on the western slope, it's these big picture structural long-term issues that are, not to say that you can't have impacts from flash drought. We saw that in 2018 to some extent, like in the Four Corners, and even this year to some extent. But I'm more concerned about these kind of longer term, bigger issues, and with the water on the western slope, because so much of the water already that is there is at least getting stored in the reservoirs to hold over from one year to the next, and not everywhere has that kind of backup reservoir, in addition to the snowpack. And the good news is we even in a warming climate, and we're going to see warmer winters and declines in snowpack, but it's still going to snow in the mountains. We're still going to we're not going to go winters where it just doesn't snow at all. And so there's a little bit of that buffer there, but you can see how much the system gets stressed even with a year or two of really hot conditions, let alone a decade or two.
Thanks, Russ. So DK, one of our viewers took an extreme interest in your chart showing how much land's at what elevation, and they're hoping for some clarification. And the question is this: the land that's above 9,000 or 9,500 feet accounts for just 15% of the land. Is that pertaining to the whole Colorado River Basin, or just the river district portion of the basin that's in Colorado?
So that is based on the Colorado River District. This table here, good, thank you for bringing that up. I'm sorry, I'm going to correct myself. This analysis was done by Don Meyer in our office, and it takes in the entire upper Colorado River Basin. So you can see here, and I went through it too quickly, but if you add up to about this here, 9,000 feet, that's about 15% of the landmass of the upper Colorado River Basin. So it's sort of that banded analysis, and it's a rough analysis, but one that I think we can all understand that these are very vulnerable lands. They can be vulnerable to changes. And when we, as Russ said, we need to understand those areas that are hard to access. We can either do that through remote sensing or through that airborne snow observatory or some combination thereof. And in fact, the third piece is just modeling and looking at the meteorological signals and trying to predict through numerical ways how much snow is falling in those bands to help us. And so those generate, again, on an average basis, about 85% of the water flow of the basin flowing into really to Lee Ferry.
Okay, and at that, you went over this, but remind us about the runoff efficiency. Only 10% of the snow water equivalent actually reaches the streams. Is that what you said?
That's correct, and that's from the State of the Science report from Western Water. So that's their number. And I should go back to that 85% number because it's confusing. It's also a temporal thing when we're only looking at the season, April through July. Okay, we're only looking at the snow melt season.
Thank you. So DK, this one's for you too, and it relates to your involvement with the Lower Gunnison project. And the question is this: so now we're making open ditches and we're piping them, and we're making a field application of water more efficient, not flood irrigation. So that affects return flows. And the question drills deeper into, are we, we created an environment with inefficient irrigation, if you will, but it's a new riparian environment. And now are we going to go backwards to the detriment of wildlife and perhaps other beneficiaries of inefficient irrigation?
Yeah, that's also a very astute observation. And so what we've done through agricultural practices and irrigation-induced runoff is we've moved the riparian habitat from the stream system to the ditch system, right? So we've essentially moved it out and we've actually degraded some of that habitat. And I'm not a biologist, so need that disclaimer, but my understanding is there's a higher quality riparian habitat along the natural stream that we're trying to restore, but we understand the adverse impacts of efficiency. The cottonwoods galleries that have established themselves along these ditch banks provide really good habitat. And what we're doing as part of these projects is actually mitigating or replacing some of those lost habitat values. So especially when we're using federal dollars to invest in pipe, we are going to another area and improving habitat in lieu of that lost habitat. So it's challenging because some backyards will be adversely impacted, but overall, when you look at the habitat quality and the number of acres will increase over time if we do this correctly. But it increases the cost, the complexity, and so it's not. I want to make sure people know what we're doing in the Lower Gunnison is not a silver bullet. It's going to take many years and many millions of dollars to do this. We're going to do it slowly, and all of these, again, using federal dollars, are subject to the National Environmental Policy Act. That means studying, reporting, and disclosing all impacts associated with those federal investments. So those are reports that are also available, and we can provide that to folks that are trying to understand these impacts and where they're possibly occurring.
So we have another question that both of you might want to take a crack at. So we've talked about how more precipitation may fall as rain. And the question is, has there been any research done on the efficiency of capturing a more rain-based precipitation pattern as opposed to snowmelt-based? And furthermore, is there an advantage to the basin if a larger percentage of the precipitation comes as rain?
I'll take the first shot, and then Russ, you can probably correct me. From our perspective here, we talked about flash droughts. Now we're talking about essentially flash floods. The the rains typically come in faster, shorter bursts, which are harder to control rather than snowmelt. Snowmelt comes off slowly, as you know, can infiltrate slower and refill the groundwater system more efficiently. Okay, so what happens is it causes a lag in the system. That water is not permanently lost. It's lost in that year. It comes out in a subsequent year. Rain, typically, you know, obviously if we have a nice long soft rain, that's not what I'm talking about, but these rains that could come quicker through severe weather typically transport more sediments, are harder to capture. They fall below our reservoir systems. Our reservoir systems have grown up and been designed to capture snowmelt, of course. So this rain could bypass those reservoirs and typically have not been a big fraction of our water balance. So that's my quick take. I mean, obviously, when we have rains that fall in a widespread area at the right time and the right location, it can help us. But typically, our systems are not designed to capture and take advantage of those rains.
Thanks, DK. Russ, you want to take a crack?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add there. I pretty much agree. The rains are a lot spottier and right, and they come quicker, as DK said. So I think that's a bigger challenge. And as my predecessor Nolan would always say, our snowpack is well behaved. We can, you know, things are changing, but we still can predict pretty reasonably what's going to happen to that snow, you know, in the springtime as it starts to run off. But you know, and we can keep good tabs on that. But the rain, I think, is a lot more challenging. So I'm not sure there would be any advantages to kind of to this shift necessarily, because we kind of know what to expect with the snow.
Here's a question, Russ, regarding temperature. The questioner notes that Alamosa recently set both a high and a low record on the same date. How unusual is this, and is it a phenomenon that will occur more frequently with climate change?
Yeah, so Alamosa's had quite a string of things this year. They had a really warm period back in the spring, and then now this, you know, twice on the same date. I see it. I'm not sure whether it's the sort of thing that you expect to see more frequently. You know, getting down to cold in the summer like that is in a way is connected to how dry it is, because you can get colder at night if it's you know, if there's less moisture in the air. So in that sense, it, you know, there is maybe a little bit of a connection there. But the San Luis Valley is such a fascinating weather and climate place that I don't think we actually understand as well as we could. So I think some of it can be written up to as a quirk of what it's like to be at, you know, in a super dry place at 8,000, 9,000 feet up there. So I probably wouldn't ascribe too much to that particular, you know, set of events of getting a high and a low on the same day. It's the sort of thing that can happen in the San Luis Valley, and not very many other places can see that sort of thing occur.
Thanks, Russ. Let's see here. DK, this concerns River District policy. And the question is the River District considering participating in the demand management program for conserving water use? And there's a lot of nuance there, so good luck.
I'll try to talk quickly. I see Zane wanting to come in, and we're running out of time. But yes, the River District is very curious, I would say, about demand management. The cards are still down, so to speak, and we're trying to solicit more input and understand how we might be able to do this, if we might do this. We have a grant to help us do that. And again, the whole concept, I think, is a good one. How it might get implemented, there's a whole series of questions that we need to address in conjunction with our constituents and our board. Our board is very engaged, and our board will dictate those policies. As staff, we take our direction from our board, and so I'll defer to them. And we do have a board meeting coming up and I would encourage folks to listen in July. I think it's the 21st, and because we'll be talking about demand management. It's a topic, a very complex and difficult concept. So I'll leave it there, and thank folks for asking those kind of questions.
Dave, I'll chime in quickly on demand management. It was just too ripe for me not to jump in with a little bit of an answer. I would remind the constituent that posed the question that the River District Board was very influential in ensuring that as the state adopted a policy for the exploration of demand management, our board was very clear that any demand management policy should ensure that any program is temporary, voluntary, and compensated, and furthermore that it doesn't disproportionately impact water users on the west slope. And quite frankly, I think it's our job at the River District, and DK and his folks in the engineering wing at the River District are doing a great job of examining all potential alternatives. I think it's our question as the representative of west slope water users to ensure that we have sought out all other potential alternatives and that this isn't looked at as kind of the default program to go to. So with that, I think we could talk about demand management for hours more, but good plug on the River District Board meeting, Dave. We do have a meeting coming up on the 21st where demand management and a whole host of other important issues facing West Slope water users will be discussed. We also have the Yampa Basin State of the River meeting coming up here on June 29th. That'll be an evening meeting also hosted on Zoom. You can register for that event at our website, coloradoriverdistrict.org, or you can find it on our Facebook page under the events section. So with that,
July.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what I said, but thank you, July. With that, I'll wrap it up and thanks again to Russ and DK and Jim for facilitating the Q&A. Thanks to everybody that participated. Keep an eye out for our next Water With Your Lunch. The date is still TBD, but sometime in August we'll be back and likely a conversation on the importance of the historic calling structures on the West Slope, and on the main stem of the Colorado. With that, I'll say goodbye and thank everybody again for being with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.